The problem with any kind of label, of which ADHD is one, is that your unconscious mind listens to every word you say and every thought you have. And your unconscious mind is brilliant at following instructions. It will bring you the subject of your thoughts. And it doesn't take Einstein to work out that if ADHD is constantly on your mind, your unconscious will act to bring ADHD to you. It's really important that how you think about it changes. The very first thing is that you'll hear people say, oh, I've got, and we're using ADHD as an example, I've got ADHD or I have ADHD. What no one says is, I'm doing ADHD. Now, the difference between I've got it or I have it and I'm doing it is that if I'm doing it, I can stop doing it. And that brings us to the next issue, is there are whole industries around maintaining the fact that you've got it or have it, and there isn't really anybody focused on showing you how to let it go or release it. And it doesn't take much to work out. There isn't any money in the sort of cure. All the money is tied up in the maintenance. And you'll see on LinkedIn, if you've got any kind of coaching in your background, you'll be bombarded right now with, become an ADHD coach. This is, this brave new world. And really the last thing anybody that's doing ADHD needs is a coach who also has ADHD. I can't see that working too well. And it's one of those marketing tricks. So in the marketing world, it's understood that if I can describe my prospect's pain, articulate it, if you like, in a better way than the prospect can, the prospect thinks, wow, that person really understands me. They must know the answer. But actually, there isn't any evidence as to whether they know the answer or they don't. All they've learned is a particular way to do marketing. And that's a problem, because it's actually manipulating you to believe in them when they actually haven't earned that right. So be particularly careful about who you pay attention to online. The next problem with something like ADHD is that what we're doing, if we're not careful, is identifying with a particular problem. And then when we make that problem part of our identity, a bit like the saying I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic or any one of these other ways, these labels that we use to define us, what we're actually doing is making it much harder to release. So if you're doing ADHD, please do not become a public speaker on the topic of ADHD. Do not write a book on the subject of, guess what, ADHD, because all you're doing is repeat, 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 and you're literally drumming that in to yourself, and that makes it much, much harder to release. So sometimes analogies are helpful to help us understand things. And when I'm working with people who've been doing ADHD, one of the animals we talk about is the meerkat. And if you watch meerkats on the nature programs on TV, they're always scanning, looking like this, and what they're doing is they're looking for danger. And that's probably one of the best representations in the natural world of the symptoms, if you like, of ADHD. It's not that the meerkats can't pay attention to anything for a long period of time. The problem is that if they do, a predator might sneak up and grab them. So when we, as human beings, have been traumatized by a threat, our threat response becomes accentuated, it becomes exaggerated. And so we're always scanning, what's going on, where does the threat come from? And I do hear people talking about, oh, well, my interpersonal skills are better. Well, there's a reason that you've developed those skills, because it's helping you understand whether there is a threat in your vicinity or whether everything's okay. If you hadn't been exposed to that threat, you wouldn't need to be paying attention, you wouldn't feel the need to pay attention to people so closely to see if they were going to be a threat to you. The problem is that sort of permanent attention paying and moving attention across many different places and people is very energy sapping. It's not the natural state. It's like you're on high alert because there's a lion or whatever the predator's going to be all the time, rather than once every so often. Yes, and if you notice, the meerkats will take it in turn to be on guard. It won't be, you know, unpopular little Johnny Meerkat who always gets put on guard duty, because that would exhaust him. Yeah, just like ADHD, if you're doing it, will exhaust you. Another important point to remember with something like ADHD is people identifying it as some kind of superpower on one end of the spectrum, or as an excuse on the other. You know, this explains everything. This is why I'm like this. This is my sort of built-in excuse that I can use for everything now. And again, we're just making it part of our identity, which is spectacularly unhelpful. When we claim it's a superpower, what it means is we're directing our energy towards that and saying, oh, this is why we're this or why we're that. And actually, it's not an energy neutral process. So to my mind, that isn't someone being in their flow. That's someone coming up with a reason. In my language, it would be an excuse for remaining the way that they are, and for this being their special differentiator. My advice would be, you don't want anything like this to be your special differentiator. You can be just as creative or whatever else you want to be without still doing ADHD. The thing that no one talks about, certainly not that I've seen, is where it comes from. If you look back in your life, virtually any psychologist will tell you that much of your life is governed by what happened to you in very early childhood. Oprah's book with the psychiatrist Dr. Steve Perry is actually called What Happened to You. There's a giant clue. And what happens if we're in an environment which has been communicated to us non-verbally? So before the age of 2, before we're able to speak, our brain apparently is in theta state. It's a different form of brainwave, and we're learning in a different way. That means we're learning from body language clues in our environment. Now, of course, if we didn't learn that way, we would be vulnerable because we wouldn't be learning the life skills we needed later to survive as a human being. But in that state, we don't have any filters. We're just literally sucking in our environment. So if that environment is in any way traumatizing, i.e. there's some kind of threat or danger to our survival, it's highly likely that our learned response will be diagnosed as the symptoms of, quote, ADHD. And there's another ingredient here, which is also our natural threat response. So we can interpret the same situation in a number of different ways, simply depending on our innate character. And there's also learning that can take place. So, for example, if a child grows up where the parents routinely handle a harmless spider, for example, oh, there's a spider, it's coming out of the rain, let's pick it up gently and put it outside, and that'll be nice for the spider, that child will learn how to handle a spider. If, on the other hand, one or other or both parents come into the room, see a spider and go, ah, God, there's a spider, there's millions of them, blah, 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 that child, quite unsurprisingly, might get to learn to fear spiders. Now, I'm using the harmless spider as a simple example because a lot of parents will think, oh, yes, we had a happy family home. We didn't shout at our child or do this or do that or do the other. But actually what imprinted on the child was all the non-verbal stuff that the parents have no idea about. And that's somewhere that might be classified as a really good home. You can still accidentally traumatize your own child without realizing it, without getting into the obvious bad behaviors. So if you've got a very dominant and aggressive alpha male in the family, you might easily traumatize the children. if that dominant male is together with a passive or submissive or anxious female, you get double jeopardy, because you've got the anxious response of the female with the aggressive drive of the male creates a much bigger emotional gap between the two parents. Obviously, it can be the other way around. You could have a hyper-aggressive female and a dominant or submissive anxious male. But either way, the child is taking, the response to aggression must be anxiety, which then makes that threat appear bigger than it really is. Yeah, obviously, if that threat manifests into physical violence, then obviously the threat is extremely real. But the point is that the learning is going in at the unconscious level, and that's where you have to go if you want to release it. Taking drugs, prescription medication to minimize the symptoms of ADHD may help you cope. And I've certainly heard of people talking about the fact that, oh, when I take my medication, I know how normal people feel. And it's like, wait a second, no. All you actually know is this is how people on medication feel. You don't know how normal unmedicated people feel, who haven't been in your environment, haven't had your life experience, and haven't had your stuff imprint on them. Yes, it's not about blame, it's about understanding, and that's another thing that's really important to do, is you don't blame people for things that happen to them, right? When this happened, most people were very small children or babies, had really nothing to do with what's happened to them other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I don't really think you can blame a child for that. So we said the root of ADHD lies in fear and anxiety, and the trick is to understand where your first event is. If you don't know consciously, try just writing down, literally one-liners of your life history. Sometimes we'll just sketch things out on a piece of paper with a client, so we can literally get something down in 10 minutes and go in that way and take things out. But once you start to understand how early this happened, and there's a caveat here, because most people will consciously remember their biggest event, the divorce of parents, a big argument at home, being bullied at school. Those sort of things people tend to remember, but the smaller stuff, the earlier stuff, tends not to be remembered consciously. So you really have to learn to trust yourself a bit and let your unconscious take you back to where that first event really is. To make things a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complicated, your first event may be in somebody else's life. And conventional science doesn't go in for that kind of thing. Conventional science is what we call the 3D world. We're talking about a 4D world here. It's different. So don't let that put you off. Look on my recommendations. If you want to look on LinkedIn, I think I've got 54 people now who you can see who they all are, have said how magical this stuff is and how it works. That doesn't constitute a scientific study. Of course it doesn't. It's all anecdotal evidence of people's individual experiences. But if 54 people are saying, this worked for me and has changed my life, just maybe it can do the same for you too. So we have to go back and find your first event, and then we have to understand what is it we need to learn that would allow you to let go of the emotion. And once you start to do that, you'll find that your ADHD symptoms either reduce or disappear. Now, whether they reduce or disappear depends on the amount of learning that you need. It depends on the number of emotions that are tied up, and it also depends on the degree to which you want to identify it with it. So some people want to hang on to something negative because they think it's a weapon to use in the future. And it's only when we're able to persuade them that no, that is a destructive strategy, not a constructive strategy, that we finally get them to put that thing down and let it go. Your instincts are in a different part of your brain, so maybe we should talk about that. So we're talking here with emotion about the limbic brain, but your instincts are in the lizard brain, the amygdala. It's a different part. And what I mean by that is that your instincts to get angry, to get sad, to be fearful, a bit like crossing the road. If you cross the road and I was looking and you suddenly saw a bus coming, you jump out the way instinctively. That will all still work. We're talking about letting go of unresolved emotions that are associated with the limbic brain. And by the way, we store most of this stuff in our gut. So a lot of people also have bloating. Clients have told me that the bloating has disappeared. Some have told me their IBS symptoms have, guess what, disappeared. Some have had even more serious medical conditions to do with the intestine, where the symptoms go down. Obviously, they need to go through some healing as well if they've got significant damage in their intestine. But the point is, this core emotion lives with this gut brain, the enteric brain that we have, and it's really important. So for both your mental health and your biological health, that you let go of these destructive emotions. So one of the reasons I want to keep this video sort of short and to the point, and I don't want to go into detail, is back to the point I made at the beginning, is if you're doing ADHD, it's not something you should be focused on learning more about, because being focused on it brings you to do more of the same. What you actually should be focused on is letting it go. And what I want to bring to the world is the fact that you can let it go. There's many other labels where exactly the same applies, is that once you release the emotion and the associated beliefs, you can actually let this stuff go and you will never need to do ADHD again.